Welcome to our second video on our term project. This one is going to discuss phase 2, essentially how you are going to do your precedent study. Please remember these videos are explanations of the various phases of our term project, but you need to make sure that you review the written document, the instructions that have been provided on Blackboard and Teams. It's important that you read it very carefully. All right. Humans have designed with a certain intent since we built the very first shelter. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. As an interior designer, all of these attempts are information that you can use to advance your design. By studying existing designs, you can learn from strategies that have endured and those that quickly fell by the wayside. History can also inspire us. Just consider the range of expressions on this page. Each is highly unique and barely scratches the surface when considering the countless variations of temples, shrines, and memorials throughout time. Now, a precedent study lets us evaluate and learn from the designs of the past. They are most effective when you study a larger number of projects because you can start to identify trends, patterns, or even themes. Those that continue can often be considered a best practice. Those that vanish quickly are either highly unique to a culture or moment in time, or maybe it wasn't very successful. Here is a very simple example. When you start your search, you're likely going to find that all the structures are made from a hard, enduring material, some sort of stone. The simple conclusion is that if you want your place of honor to withstand time, you should consider building with certain materials. This is an obvious conclusion, but a good precedent study can provide you much more nuanced information about the design, the atmosphere, and even the human experience. Now, when you are selecting which projects to choose for precedent studies, the most common criterion is that its function is similar in nature to the project you're working on. In this case, a place of honor for an individual. It will not be a surprise if you select some religious spaces because of the emphasis on a single entity. Just remember that worship is not a function we are engaging. I will provide you some additional criteria for your selection process at the end of this presentation. It's also, of course, recorded in the instructions on Blackboard and Teams. For now, let's focus on what each step requires. Our sample for this precedent study is the Parthenon. I chose this one because it meets the requirements where a single entity is the focus, and even more so because the entity is Athena, a figure that has a relationship with my fictional character, Athena Justice. The latter is just a bonus and will not happen frequently, if at all, for your character. So don't worry about that. Now, once you identify an appropriate precedent, you will provide the necessary identifying information, which includes the official name of the project, the Parthenon here, where it's located, Athens, Greece, date of construction, 438, 432 BCE, and if you can find it, the names of the designers. In this case, we do note Iktinos and Callicrates were the architects, and Phidias was really the project supervisor, but also the sculptor or artist on the project. So this is part one of the identification. What is it? Where is it located? When was it built? Who built it? Really is just a brief description of the purpose of this particular building. Why was it constructed? And a ritual that happens inside. So first, the purpose. That'll be this first paragraph right here. The Parthenon honors the goddess Athena, patron saint of the city of Athens. It was constructed in recognition of the Greeks' victory over the Persians and an acknowledgement, perhaps, of the god's hands in the outcome. All right? That's why it was built. Now, one of the rituals, which is also part of the purpose, is here. Now, this will take some research. You'll need to start looking these up. These are a little bit more tricky to find. Perhaps going to your librarian for assistance would also be an option. Those Greeks who prescribed to the pantheon of Olympians believed that the gods could intervene in human affairs. During more formal ceremonies, rituals included the sacrificing of animals, or pouring out drinks accompanied by prayers as forms of offerings when asking for their guidance or blessing. This usually occurred at an altar outside the temple, but in view of the statue. The interior of the temple was not the place for formal ceremonies. Instead, it was perceived as the home of the goddess, or a place they would visit frequently. The Greeks could enter the temple on their own and leave offerings, flowers, incense, or food, at the foot of the statue or on the base of the statue for more personal requests. Now, please make sure you provide the references from where you get this information. I have an example of this phase also in the instructions so that you can see what I've done in reference to that. You do want to make sure they come from credible sources. Don't go to someone's part-time blog. Make sure they really are kind of an expert in the field. Now, that's the information gathering phase, all right? This is stuff you can look up and you want to present, right? The next phase is analysis. This comes from your personal observation and your ability to evaluate a design project relative to the elements and principles of design. So, here what you're going to do is you're going to identify and describe the most impactful and significant design elements and principles in the space. So that means you don't have to do all of them. You're finding the ones that really kind of step out into the forefront and are a major component of the design. As discussed in class, the linear axis is a defining element in a temple, usually such as the one at Karnak, which we've studied by now, and of course in the Parthenon as well. This tells us that line is impactful because it is defining our path and helping to arrange the space as a line that bisects a symmetrical interior, which is a reference to balance. All right? So this is our observation about what line is doing in this particular instance. You want to take all that information now to create a clear statement that connects the role and purpose of the line as an axis and its secondary effect, balance. You're going to begin the statement with the two major components, the element, line, and the principle, balance. Now there might be an occasion where it's two elements or it could be two principles, but more often than not, you should be talking about an element and a principle because it's the thing and how it was used. So here's what we've written. Defined by its two terminal points, the front door, right, and the statue, the linear axis marks the primary path of travel, splitting the plan symmetrically in two and creating a balanced interior. Now, note that I used additional design language to succinctly communicate a great deal of information in this short sentence. I used point, I used axis, and I use symmetry. Okay? So symmetry is the type of balance. Axis is a historical term. It relates to the path. And point, of course, is an element of design. But it was not the important one here. It was line. All right, here's another example. In this observation, I noticed that the columns are visually quite dominant inside the interior, right? They're just all over the place. They're surrounding Athena. Columns are forms. So columnar forms is one way to refer to them here. Columnar forms. This lets me use an historical term, column, and a design element term, form. Having identified the columns as impactful, I recognize that they're spaced equidistant from each other, all the way around the interior. This repetition, another design term, can lead to a rhythm, another design term. Finally, I have the opportunity to mention the effect on the atmosphere of the space the way the columns are laid out, which is quite calming because of their regularity. It's how someone feels in the space. And it's a unifying element, which is the overarching principle I'm interested in here. Unity. So, here, form, our element, unity, our principle, our statement, the two tiered, repetitive columnar forms placed at regular intervals, which is rhythm, creates a calm, unified interior. That's a really impactful statement. It tells the reader so much. And in many cases, the reader in this case is kind of you, because this is information that you are gathering through your analysis that you might use in your own design. Now, there are 3 other samples listed in the instructions that I gave so that you can kind of get used to what we're looking for here and the wide variety of approaches that you can take when pairing an element with a principle. Now, the next question that you need to answer, which is in the instructions, is describe how people move through the space. What is their destination and why? Primary movement through space is important to identify. Is it direct? Do we wander through the space? This is part of the experience and is very intentional on the part of the designer and the purpose of the space. So, here, what I've written, the primary path is from front door directly to the statue. Visitors progress toward the statue in order to make an offering to and a request of Athena. The brilliant gold of her tunic draws the eye. The height of the statue and the uninterrupted volume of the space beckons the eye upward. Now, note that I could have stopped after the second sentence. I could have stopped here. However, the description of Athena and the volume helps to pull me forward. Okay, I'm drawn toward this large statue, and her height and everything else, this volume, keeps me looking upward towards her. That is part of the space's effect on my movement through space. It also allowed me to continue my analysis and use of vocabulary, such as the word tunic here and volume here. Next, all right, we design for humans, and most of the time for people other than ourselves. That's a critical way of thinking for interior designers. Never forget that. That experience is crucial. We really try to embed that in your thought process and your design process through all of your projects. In this case, I'm going to want you to consider the mental, physical, and physiological impacts of being in this space. So, mental, what am I saying? Well, what am I thinking about when I enter this space? Well, because the path is uninhibited and easy, I walk in the door, I head straight for Athena, my mind is able to focus on why I'm here, to make some kind of request from the goddess. Physiologically, I might be experiencing humility and anticipation. Those are kind of my feelings inside, and that's what I'm going through. Physically, the floor is cold to the touch. Hard surfaces reflect sound, so I'm guessing it's probably pretty echoey in here. There's bright sun coming from somewhere, which obviously is the front door in this case. And that's an interesting observation because I've essentially identified the direction of the Parthenon, the way that it faces. It must face east for the sun to come in during the morning hours. All right, so let's wrap all that up into an experience statement. The distance to the statue gives the visitor time to prepare mentally for their transaction, right? Feelings of humility and anticipation, mixed with admiration and hope, arise when approaching a goddess with a request. Cold stone passes underfoot, while hard surfaces reflect sound. The marble interior provides relief from the heat outdoors. Bright sun from the front door strikes a beam of light across the floor and onto the statue during the morning hours. All right, now look, that's written in a very different way than our very analytical statements about the design elements and principles. And there's a little bit of poetry in here because we're trying to, provide an experience or a bit of an atmosphere for ourselves to remember that this is what it was like to be in the Parthenon. Also, a good hint or tip for writing: look at how many times you use the word is, are, was, be, or anything of that nature. That is usually followed by another word that could be a better verb for you when describing something. So consider here: cold stone passes underfoot. Hard surfaces reflect sound. My action words are very descriptive. Strikes a beam, okay? Think about that when you're writing. Just look for the is, was, are, be forms, and if you've got them, there's probably a better verb that you can use. All right, that's step 2.4. Now, step 2.5 is conceptual connections. So here what we're trying to do is we're asking ourselves, how does the design reflect the characteristics, traits, or deeds of this entity? Clearly, there must be something important about Athena that has been embedded in the design of the space. In other words, what aspect of the entity seems to be abstracted or considered in the design of the space? Well, one thing that I've very quickly noticed is that the size of the statue reflects the godly status of Athena, one that is greater than humans. All right? So conceptually, we're looking at the fact that Athena is a goddess. There is a hierarchy here, one that creates a relationship between the goddess and the person coming in to make the request. And thus, the size was important. I mean, the designer could have easily made it human scale. That would make it more relatable, but that's a different message and that's a different relationship between the goddess and the individual that's coming in. Again, I have some other options for you listed in the instructions, some other examples. Okay, finally, for the conclusion of this specific precedent study, this one being for the Parthenon, I want you to write a summary, a very brief one. Really just tell me, what do you think was the goal of the designer, the primary goal, and how did they achieve it? Okay? So everything since we've been studying the Parthenon seems to be, we keep going back to Athena, this statue. So I'm thinking to myself, that's the goal. The goal is to focus on the statue. So my summary is, the goal of the designer was to make the statue the focal point of the interior. This is evident in its size, its position, and materiality. That's gold on her, by the way. The repetitive linear elements on the floor, ceiling, and the columns do not distract the visitor, but instead continue to point toward the statue. Everything is leading us towards her. So that's just our quick summary of this specific precedent study, the Parthenon. Now, at some point, you will complete 5 precedent studies. After you complete all 5, you will do this final step, which is the synthesis of the information that you've been gathering or that you've been analyzing. So this will only happen after you finish the 5th precedent. You're going to review the findings of your analyses of all the projects and identify commonalities. What are some similar design strategies that people from different cultures tend to use to honor an entity in the built environment? You'll create a list of no less than 5 guidelines, these common strategies, that you might then use for the design of your own space. So here's an example. Now granted, I have not shown you 5 different precedent studies, but this will be one that I imagine is true. So one commonality after I've done my studies is that most, so maybe it's not all, but most of the precedents used precious materials on the statue to indicate the importance of the figure. So, covering so much of Athena in gold and nothing else being in gold clearly means we value and want to draw attention to this statue. We're probably going to find that in a lot of other examples. Okay, so that's an example of a commonality, something that I keep seeing over and over again. Next, I want you to identify a minimum of 3 unique design strategies from your analysis that you, A, thought were particularly creative or impactful, or B, might align specifically and effectively with the entity you selected in phase 1. All right, so the unique approach should not be a commonality. All right, this needs to be something that maybe someone did somewhere that you thought, oh, that was an interesting approach. That was an interesting idea that you did there. So here's an example. The Parthenon stacked 2 layers of columns to emphasize the height of the statue. So let's think about that. They could have easily just put single columns all the way up to floor to ceiling to hold up the building. Why didn't they do that? They just did it on the exterior of the Parthenon. Well, they did that to further emphasize, as a trick, your perception of the height of Athena. Because you just walked through a set of single height columns and you got a sense of scale of something. Like, I am this big compared to this big column. I now walked into the space and I'm still carrying that perspective with me, but Athena now has to be in a space that's 2 stories tall, at least. So that was a very interesting trick, if you will, to make me think she is even larger than she really is. All right? So that's a unique approach. All right. So here's the criteria for your precedent study selection. You're going to do 5 studies, as I've told you, and these, again, are in the instructions, and you can read them over and over again. So 1, none of your structures can be covered in my lectures. So you can look through the study guides to make sure you're not covering or you're not choosing a temple, a shrine, or memorial, or whatever that I'm going to talk about in the future. All right? The next one is date. Now, when you look at the list of what you can choose from, I want you to make sure that 3 of the first 4 were built before 1800. Okay? 3 of the first 4 are built before 1800. That means 1 of the first 4, and it can be any one, can be anytime. They could be 1800, 1900, 2000, yesterday. Number 5 can also be any time period, all the way up to 2021. All right? Now, location. The location is going to be different. So when you look at the instructions, you're going to have to choose 1 precedent study from Europe, 1 from Asia, 1 from Africa, 1 from Central or South America, or the Middle East. All right? So those are 4 very specific areas of the world that I want you to find a precedent study. Europe, Asia, Africa. You must do those 3. And then you can choose from Central or South America or the Middle East for a 4th one. Of those 4, 3 of them must be built before 1800. Okay? Now the 5th one, I'm giving you free choice. The 5th location is your choice. It can be from anywhere, including a place another precedent comes from. So you might have 2 from Asia. Hopefully not from the exact same city, but maybe they're from different countries. But it's your choice. It does not have a date restriction. And I'm giving you the opportunity, if you want, your 5th one can be a fictional place. So maybe you're doing something, maybe your character is from a magical world, and you know that there is a place of honor in a magical world in a movie where you have enough information to be able to do a precedent study. Now that's important. You have to be able to have enough info to do the study. But it can be fictional. I leave that up to you. If you have any questions about these, please feel free to ask me. Now, for all these, you also must have access to at least one interior and one exterior image, and preferably a floor plan. If you're really having trouble with a floor plan, come talk to me and we'll see if you can draw one loosely or something of that nature. But those are 3 really important pieces. The overall goal is variety, all right? All of your precedent studies should look really quite different. Don't pick someone that built essentially a Greek temple in Africa and a Greek temple in the United States and a Greek temple in Japan, right? Because then you're just getting the same exact information. You're looking for people who had very different expressions for trying to build places that honor a single individual. Also, you'll notice I've added some resources and search tips in the instructions to help you get started, trying to identify these different precedent studies. The schedule for the due dates for the phase 2 is different than all the rest because I have spread them out over a few weeks. The reason is because I want to give you an opportunity to practice with a precedent study before you do your next set. I will be able to give you feedback before you turn in the next 2 precedent studies. And then after you turn those in, you'll get more feedback and turn in 2 more precedent studies. So remember, there are 5 due in total. For the first one, January 30th, you only have 1 precedent study due. And this should be your precedent study from Europe. You'll get feedback. You then have your next set, which is 2 precedent studies, due February 13th. This should be your studies from Asia and from Africa. And then your final set of studies is February 27th, where you will submit the one from Central or South America or the Middle East and your personal choice study. Now the difference with phase 2C is you will now add the synthesis. The synthesis is where you will look across all of your precedent studies and find commonalities or common strategies that you kept seeing over and over again, because that means it's almost like a best practice. You'll also identify a series of unique strategies, meaning something that happened here in this project that was really effective and I didn't see anywhere else, and I think it might be a really good idea when I consider, my design. More information can be seen in the instructions on the synthesis. Each of these, as always, will be due via Teams by 11 p.m. As always, feel free to ask questions via Teams chat, drop by my office, or send me an email. I'll also respond to questions at the beginning of class on January 19th. So hopefully you've read the instructions by then and listened to this video. All right, good luck.